Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel finding an unintended consequence in the law that was passed to pay the United States military while the government shut down, because he found a little hook in there that, in fact, Mr. President, I ask 2 more minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, to order.
He found a hook in there that then he could extend that to most of the furloughed civilian workforce, including some in the National Guard, but we didn't know that. And down in my state of Florida, 156 employees were getting the notices go just in the National Guard on Friday, and there was already 1,000 military technicians that had been furloughed in the National Guard, and we had an inbound storm. What about the programs in our state to help veterans find jobs? If we're not done with this shutdown at the end of October, that's gone. How about the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, a part of the state of government? 10% of their funds are federal funds. How about the Florida Department of Agriculture? Over 6% of their workforce are federally funded. And what about, and you've heard this out here, what about women, infants, and children? You know, a society is supposed to take care of its very old and its very young. And that's why we have programs for women, infants, and children. And yet, the supplemental nutrition program for women, for nursing mothers, for children up to the age of 5, for breastfeeding support, for nutrition education, for health checkups. It's gone. Mr. President, I could go on and on. Others have said it more articulately than me. This is ridiculous. This shouldn't go on like this. And now, as the drumbeat of the crescendo continues, it will grow louder as we march toward October the 17th, when the debt ceiling has to be raised so we don't go into default. Mr. President, it's a sad day. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I rise to speak in support of 2 individuals who will come up for a vote at 5 o'clock. Now, we haven't set any records here in the Senate in the last 5 weeks for productivity. We passed one major piece of legislation, which the Senator from Oregon brought before us, relative to the issue of our helium preserve. Great work. One of the few bipartisan things we've accomplished in 5 weeks. Maybe the only bipartisan thing. Well, here's a chance to improve our record at 5 o'clock. There are 2 nominees for federal district court judge in Illinois that I commend to the members of the United States Senate. And let me say at the outset, it isn't just this side of the aisle and this senator making the recommendation. Senator Mark Kirk and I worked together on a bipartisan basis to come up with these nominees and to get them approved by our nomination committees, then approved by us, by the White House, by the Judiciary Committee, brought to the floor. Since Senator Kirk's been elected, we have done this in lockstep together every step of the way. And by tradition, the President's party senator, in this case myself, has 3 appointments. Senator Kirk has the 4th. But each of us has the veto power over the other's choices. So we have a working relationship and a good one. And Senator Kirk has endorsed these 2 nominees, Colin Bruce, who's been nominated to serve in the Central District of Illinois, and Sarah Ellis, nominated to serve in the Northern District. They have the experience, qualifications, and integrity to be excellent judges. Both appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on June 19th. Both reported out of the committee by unanimous voice vote. I'd like to briefly discuss their backgrounds and qualifications. Colin Bruce, nominated to fill the judicial vacancy open in Urbana when Judge Michael McCuskey took senior status. Michael McCuskey is also one of my appointments, an outstanding federal judge. I'm sorry that he's going on senior status. But he felt, and I did too, that Colin Bruce would be an excellent replacement to succeed him in that position. Mr. Bruce has worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of Illinois since 1989. Currently serves as the first Assistant U.S. Attorney, a position he's held since 2010. Now, Colin Bruce applied for the position of U.S. Attorney. He didn't get it. But the man who did, the man I selected, Jim Lewis, hired him as his first assistant. So it was about 2 months ago that Jim Lewis, the U.S. District Attorney, came by my office with Colin Bruce. We talked about a number of things, and then he said, and incidentally, I don't know what I'd do without Colin Bruce. He's such an extraordinary first assistant. When he finished his presentation, I said, Jim, would you stick around for a minute? Colin, go outside if you would. And I said, Jim, I've got an opening for a judge here. And I know Colin is a person who would fill that bill. He's already gone through all the vetting. He'd be an extraordinary judge, but you'd lose him as your first assistant. He said, I can't stand in his way. I couldn't think of a better choice to be the judge in this district. Colin Bruce was born in Urbana, Illinois. He got his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Illinois, went straight to the U.S. Attorney's Office out of law school, handled criminal, civil cases, bankruptcy, and tort claims filed against the government. Shifted to prosecuting complex criminal matters, drug fraud, and cybercrime cases. 2007, appointed branch chief of the Urbana Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. 2010, first assistant U.S. Attorney, which is the #2 position, as I mentioned. In his current capacity, he oversees the day-to-day operations of the U.S. Attorney's Office, supervises all the federal criminal investigations, prosecutions, and appeals in the district, as well as civil defense and affirmative litigation in the district in which the U.S. is a party. He's received numerous recognitions, certifications of appreciation from the Justice Department, the FBI, the DEA, as well as awards from the Illinois State Police, the Metropolitan Enforcement Group, and Task Force. He has a record of giving back to the Urbana community through his association with charities like Untitled Chapter of the American Red Cross and Imagine No Malaria, a charity purchasing mosquito nets for families in Africa. He's an outstanding nominee for the federal bench and has a great family that he brought to the hearing. And I certainly urge my colleagues to join with Senator Kirk and me in supporting his nomination. Now, the second nominee is Sarah Ellis. She's been nominated to the Chicago-based judgeship that was formerly occupied by Judge Joan Gottschall. Ms. Ellis currently works at a prestigious law firm, Schiff Hardin, in Chicago, where her practice involves white-collar criminal matters, complex civil litigation, and corporate counseling. She was born in Ontario, Canada, to parents who had immigrated from Jamaica. She moved to the United States, became a citizen at the age of 15. Her undergraduate degree is from Indiana University, her law degree from Loyola University School of Law in Chicago. After law school, Ms. Ellis joined the Federal Defender Program in Chicago, served for 6 years as a staff attorney, and in this capacity, she represented indigent criminal defendants in all aspects of criminal litigation, preliminary hearings, trials, sentencing hearings, and appeals. Then worked in private practice for several years before joining the City of Chicago Department of Law in 2004, where she served as Assistant Corporation Counsel for 4 years, primarily handling Section 1983 cases. In 2008, Ms. Ellis joined Schiff Hardin, where she handles criminal and civil matters. She served as adjunct professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, teaching federal criminal practice and legal writing. A distinguished record of pro bono work and community service. She's taught reading and legal skills to children living in juvenile detention, and she's provided legal advice and guidance to the Warren Park Youth Baseball League. She's also actively involved with St. Gertrude Catholic Parish in Chicago. She's on the board of the parish school, the Northside Catholic Academy. An excellent nominee for federal judge. Another person with a great family and children backing her up, and I'm happy that Senator Kirk and I can commend her as well to the Senate for this nomination. I hope my colleagues will join me in voting to confirm these two nominees who have bipartisan support and will be outstanding federal judges. And, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Before he leaves the floor, let me thank the senator from Illinois for his kind words, and I certainly support the appointments, and we're glad we were able to get that legislation passed on a bipartisan basis to help American industry, and I thank my colleague. Mr. President, on Friday last, it was thrilling to read that the United States is now #1 in the world when it comes to energy production. not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, our country. And particularly, Mr. President, it was a source of such satisfaction because after all these years, the American people hearing about how we're dependent on foreign sources of energy, at the top of our papers Friday last, the energy experts said that the red, white, and blue was at the top in terms of energy production. And this good news story about the energy boom is obviously, as the President of the Senate knows, is absolutely essential to creating more high-skill, high-wage jobs. I saw it with my colleague when I was in his state. You see it all across the country. This energy boom, for example, has been key to triggering a manufacturing renaissance, the lower cost of natural gas in particular, being a magnet to bring companies that had gone overseas back to the United States again, employing our workers with good-paying jobs. And it's been key to the falling imports of foreign oil. And, of course, wind and solar farms are adding tremendously to the power mix. In our part of the country, it's Shepherd's Flat in eastern Oregon, our country's biggest wind farm that we are especially proud of. But, Mr. President, the current senseless government shutdown is putting this good news story at risk. When it comes to causing problems, unfortunately, this shutdown has something for everybody. If you care about oil and natural gas development, federal agencies now cannot approve drilling permits either on federal land or offshore. If you care about renewable energy, wind and wave energy permitting is now at a standstill. It's at a standstill because of the shutdown. Environmental reviews for solar farms on federal land has stopped. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has canceled a meeting about implementing 2 hydropower bills that passed this Congress, Mr. President, on overwhelming votes. Now, in my part of the country, we're especially proud of this legislation. Hydropower is responsible. It's actually the biggest source of clean power in the United States. The industry estimates that it could generate perhaps as much as 60,000 megawatts of additional clean power. And these hydropower bills, there were 2 of them, were the first standalone energy bills to become law since 2009. Now, Mr. President, they languish because of the shutdown. All of these developments that I've described with respect to natural gas development, solar and wind energy, the hydropower laws that passed overwhelmingly in both the Senate and the House, now in effect languishing, and what it really means is less new energy, fewer new jobs, and less revenue that we're going to need in both the public and the private sector. I might also add the shutdown harms the important safety work that needs to be done by blocking work that's going to speed up response to oil spills and accidents offshore. Of particular concern to me, Mr. President, and I know so many others in the Senate, I see my colleague from Alaska here, the people who get hammered, who really get hit hardest by these consequences, are our rural communities, the ones that depend on producing energy and timber and recreation. They are the ones who feel the biggest hit from the shutdown. I'm going to talk about what this really means in terms of recreation and hunting and fishing. You know, hunting season starts different times, different parts of the country, but between recreation and hunting and fishing, we're talking about something in the vicinity of $646 billion a year, Mr. President, goes just to the recreation sector. Another $140 billion plus in terms of hunting, and I'm going to describe the consequences there. But we are talking about policies with enormous impact for our rural communities. And I can tell you I got some additional news. I mentioned the thrilling news last Friday about how we were tops in terms of energy production, but it wasn't exactly a thrill last Friday to get called, Mr. President, by the chief of the Forest Service, Tom Tidwell, who called to report that the Forest Service had canceled 450 timber sales on 120 national forests across the country. So what that means is loggers, like the hard-working folks that I represent in Oregon, who want to do a hard day's work, they're being benched because of this shutdown. And the shutdown comes at a particularly ominous time, because it comes at a time with winter, at hand, in effect putting an end to logging operations for the year in many parts of our country. So that means workers won't be able to make up for lost time and money this year. They're simply, those loggers, going to have to get by with less. So again, rural communities are the face of what this really means. They're the ones that are going to get walloped, because really a handful of members of Congress, won't fund the government. So logging, energy, recreation. I mentioned the hunting season, sort of the flip side of the coin with respect to recreation. The hunting season for ducks and geese starting up in my home state and across the country. The government shutdown here is closing hundreds of wildlife refuges where those waterfowl are normally, fair game. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, hunting, fishing, and wildlife-related activities generate about $144 billion per year. Hunters contribute $5.4 billion in state and local taxes each year. Because waterfowl season, that is only 3 months long in Oregon, if you lose, a week, every lost week is a huge bite out of the benefits that hunting brings to our local economies. Now, what senators may also not be aware of is the shutdown also means that our government is less prepared to respond to these fires, these rapidly developing dangerous infernos in our national forests. The forest fire risk is lessened in some parts of the West, Mr. President, but there are areas of high to extreme danger in California, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, South Dakota, and other states. While many firefighters are considered essential, others, such as our off-duty firefighters, have been furloughed. And public safety on federal lands is also impacted by these furloughs. Although law enforcement continues, without rangers and other agency employees on hand, the conditions are ripe for visitors to find their way into severely understaffed forests and pose a safety risk. And of course, thousands of hardworking employees at these key natural resource agencies are now out of work. As we speak, 24,000 at the Forest Service, more than 10,000 furloughed at the Bureau of Land Management. And Mr. President, if they're not working, Bureau of Land Management employees can't issue permits for grazing on federal lands. Energy Department workers and contractors can't clean up nuclear waste sites like the Hanford Reservation that threatens the Columbia River and the million people who live downstream. Our committee, recognizing the situation, recently had to cancel a hearing on the Columbia River Treaty, which is vital to the energy and environment of the Pacific Northwest. It's vital, Mr. President, to our relations with Canada. This treaty is about managing a river that is the lifeblood for the Pacific Northwest. It's our lifeblood for transportation, for electricity, for fish. And there isn't much time for our two nations to really come together to decide the treaty's future. And just wrapping up, Mr. President, I would just say I've tried to describe what the shutdown means in terms of our status as #1 in energy production, what it means with respect to logging and forest fires, hunting and recreation, And it's all happening because a small group of members in the other chamber are demanding negotiations with the American economy tied to the train tracks. And I'll close with this, Mr. President. It is especially ironic that in many cases the districts of those members are the ones that are going to bear the brunt of the impacts, those rural communities. They're the ones who are going to bear the consequences of stalled energy production and stalled logging. And I hope that we can quickly come together, pass this budget without all the various additions that have made it impossible for the Congress to go forward. It's time to reopen the government. I've spent a lot of time working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle on these other issues. We'll continue to do so, and I know a lot of senators will. Right now, it is time to reopen the government and end the shutdown. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alaska.
Will the senator stay on the floor for a moment for a question? If one of the bills I know that was mentioned by the senator from Illinois before he left was the helium bill, but within that, there is an important Alaska priority. I know my colleague worked with you, and it was important to my state, and it was cleaning up these legacy wells. You know, these wells have been there on federal land for years, and, you know, oil literally seeping out of these wells, and now there's money for the first time in I don't know how many years to actually clean up these wells. But from what I just heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I have a couple more questions, but correct me if I'm wrong, but what you've just indicated was the Bureau of Land Management, they don't have the capacity to do permitting and other staffing, so these wells, there's no work to be done. Even though now we finally passed a bipartisan bill, both houses, signed by the President, something that's been waiting for decades, now to be cleaned. Am I correct on this, that BLM now can't do the work that we want them to do and the American people do, and Alaskans have been desperately waiting for decades?
What we know for certain, I would say, the Senator, is 10,000 individuals have been furloughed at the Bureau of Land Management. So clearly, this important work, and I tried to describe particularly getting these new permits. I mean, I guess if you're already out there with something, and I talked to Chief Tidwell about how he would try to stabilize operations that have, in effect, been put in place now. But yes, you're not going to be able to go forward with new operations like the Senator from Alaska has described.
I know you came to the state some time ago, a few months ago, and had an opportunity to see some of our great ability with our energy companies and what we're trying to do. And today I got an announcement, and an important announcement from Exxon and ConocoPhillips about building a gasification plant, LNG plant down in Nikiski, an area that I know you visited and had a chance to see. I didn't want to tell them yet, but I wanted to say thank you for the announcement. It would be a multi-billion-dollar investment in our state, something we've been doing already for 40 years, exporting to Japan. But now the permits they'll need, if there's any federal government permits, the odds of them getting them or getting them in a timely manner is now delayed. Is that a fair statement?
Again, the Senator is right, because Alaska, like Oregon, there is an extraordinary level of federal ownership. In my state, the federal government owns more than half of the land. And the Senator is absolutely correct with, in effect, the shutdown. Federal agencies cannot approve drilling permits, either on federal land or offshore. And I saw both when I was in Alaska. And, you know, the point is, these are issues that we can work on in a bipartisan way. And as soon as the government gets reopened, we'll set about to the task of getting those permits out and coming together on a bipartisan basis, as we've done on so many issues. But we can't do it if the government is shut down. We can't do it if we can't pay our bills. And that's what we're going to have to deal with first.
And I think, and this is more of a question comment, the last part, I'll just say that one of your statements at the end there, you talked about how this is held up. I mean, we passed a bill out of here, a continuing resolution, which we cut on an annualized basis $70 billion. We didn't compromise. We took their number. Let's make sure we're clear on all this. I know we talk about negotiate. We've negotiated starting back in July, reduced, and then we went to their number. $70 billion annualized reduction. The body passed it. And nothing passes out of this body unless you get a motion to proceed with some sort of unanimous consent or bipartisan, and that was 99-0. People forget that, 99-0 to move us to the bill. Then we moved it, sent it over to the House, where it has sat since the day we sent it over there, which would have kept this budget operating. And again, it had a $70 billion annualized reduction. I think that was your point toward the end of your comments, that a simple vote over there would put everyone back to work. These permits we just talked about, the cleaning up the legacy wells, the timber, which we have in Southeast now, Alaska is now in jeopardy because our federal lands, your federal lands, are now at risk. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and I would also note, I was one, I'm sure the senator was involved in this as well, where after all these years about hearing that the Senate hadn't passed a budget, we stayed up one night until the wee hours. We passed a budget. We had scores and scores of votes. And then a lot of us simply wanted to have a conference with the other body. And after hearing that there hadn't been a budget, we thought lickety-split we'd be able to get that conference going, and we haven't been able to do that either.
And they had passed their budget, too. So we had two budgets ready to go to conference. Is that a fair?
It was there for the doing. I remember coming to the floor and asking unanimous consent to go to conference. I knew that there had been some controversy, but there was an immediate objection, and I pointed out that at that time Republican and Democratic economists were saying, look to the long term. And I was especially proud, and I talked about it that day, saying that Senator Isaacson of Georgia, a very able member of the Finance Committee, he and I have some new ideas on Medicare that we think can protect the Medicare guarantee and hold costs down. But you can't get at those kinds of issues unless you first, as the senator says, reopen the government with that simple vote.
Well, I appreciate the comments. Thank you for answering these questions. I think it's important, again, just to point out that budget was passed back in April, May area. We did ours. They did theirs. We've tried 18 times to bring the two parties together. We've tried unanimous consent, as you've noted here on the floor, 18 times, unable to do that. Then we went to this continuing resolution. That debate and negotiation started in July. The House had one number. We had one number. As time progressed, we took their number, $70 billion annualized reduction. We took their number. Some would not call that a compromise. That would just take their number. But we'll call it negotiations compromise because we wanted to get it done. We wanted to keep the budget open. We, again, sent it over there. It has sat idle. One person, the speaker over there, could put it on the floor, and I heard him on the radio or TV this weekend explaining how the votes aren't there. Well, if the votes aren't there, put it on the floor, it will fail. But the reality is the votes are there. Just as we have taken every one of their items, brought it to the floor, we have voted on every single item they've thrown over here. They haven't prevailed, but we voted on it because that's the process. But for whatever reason over there, it's gone over there and sat idle. So if he doesn't think the votes are there, put it up. His side will win then. But there's clearly Republicans and Democrats over on the House side that want to put the government back in operation so we can get on to these bigger issues. Is that a fair chronology of events here?
It is, and what I was struck by over the weekend with respect to those comments is why not at least try that? It just seems, if you add up all the senators on both sides of the aisle who said that they would vote for what
House members.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
The House members who have said that they would vote for it, it sure looks like the votes are there, and if you're trying to break the gridlock, why not try? So I hope that that kind of thinking will set in here in the next few hours, because that would be the fastest way, as the senator from Alaska has made clear, to get the government open again.
Thank you for allowing me to ask you some questions.
I thank my colleague. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are in
day number 7 of this government shutdown. As was pointed out by the senator from Alaska and the senator from Oregon, we started out with a continuing resolution of $1.058 trillion. That was compromised down with the expectation that there would be a clean CR, I might add, to $986 billion, over a $70 billion reduction. That wasn't good enough because there were some that wanted to add different amendments to deal with the Affordable Health Care Act. Bottom line is we're in the throes of a governmental shutdown. And it's interesting that since the government was shut down, it'll be midnight tonight. It's been a solid week. We have seen bills come over from the House that would fund the VA, National Park Service. It's interesting, there's nobody, the senator from Alaska is on the Veterans Affairs Committee. We both work very hard for rural veterans in this country. But we both know that the VA can't do their job unless the IRS has funding and CMS has funding. So it's great to put that political gesture out there, but the truth is they can't do their job until we have more than just the VA funded. Then there was a story of childhood cancer. So the House came across, said, you know, maybe we ought to fund the National Institute of Health. Then there was the terrible scene last week where Capitol Police officers who were all laid off, actually they were still working without pay, had to address a lady that had driven in to a police officer's building up here by the Hart building. So since those officers responded, maybe we should pay them, so they came across with a bill for them. They should be paid all the time, I might add. Then there's the issue of Hurricane Karen, so we need to fund FEMA. So they came across with a bill to fund FEMA. And then they thought, well, you know, all these furloughed federal employees, we should pay them, and I agree, we should. Fact is, they do a great job, and they should be back here working, which every one of them want to be back here working to get that back pay. And then they decided to fund things like food inspectors because they understand that our food security is at risk. Look, these guys can't see past their political noses. The bottom line is that, as the previous speakers talked about, if in fact the Speaker of the House put the clean resolution up for $986 billion, it would pass the House. He said it wouldn't this weekend, so okay, so if it doesn't, put it up anyway. Prove us wrong. The bottom line is that it would pass, and this senseless shutdown would be over. There are plenty of things out there that continue to hamper this country's moving forward economically due to this economic shutdown. We've talked about Head Start. We've talked about Forest Service suspending logging contracts. Heard Senator from Alaska talking about drilling permits. Fact is, in Montana, being an outdoor state, people live for this time of year. It's called hunting season. And a lot of the hunting, camping, fishing sites, access has been severely restricted. This weekend, a National Guard furloughed their drill for 3,500 guardsmen. Communities around our national parks are being severely impacted, losing literally millions and millions of dollars, which is real money. So how do we get out of this? It's pretty simple. If the Speaker put the bill on the floor, it would pass. He refuses to do that. I think he refuses to do it for another reason, and that reason is that I think there's a lot of his members over there that want to cater to the Tea Party movement but go back home and want to appear like they're moderates. If they had that vote, it would certainly point out who stands for what in that body. And that's why he needs to have the vote. As was said with the Senator from Oregon, the Senator from Alaska, we've had votes on everything they've sent over here, just about. And the fact is that they need to do the same. We sent a clean CR over to them. I think unless they really want this shutdown to go on and on for some
unknown reason, they would vote on that clean CR. And then we're rapidly approaching the debt ceiling, which puts the full faith and credit of this country at risk if we don't increase it. And I might add that this isn't money that's yet to be spent. This is money that has been spent. It's not unlike the mortgage on your house or your credit card bill. If you don't pay them, interest rates will go up. And if we don't increase the debt limit, interest rates on our national debt will go up. And those that are concerned about the debt and the deficit, as I am, and others on both sides of the aisle, will see our national debt increase, not decrease, by doing something as silly as not increasing the debt ceiling. Now, I know there are some in this body that would love to put issues on the debt ceiling, and they're playing with fire. We saw what happened in 2011 when our credit rating was downgraded because we were just talking, some were just talking about not increasing the debt ceiling. The truth is that I'll be the first to work with anybody in this body to try to reduce the debt and the deficit by reducing spending, by removing tax loopholes in the code. We need to do that at the front end, not the back end. The debt limit is dealing with the issue at the back end. And if we don't do it, if we don't increase that debt ceiling, we will see the economy spiral down out of control, potentially even putting us into a depression. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that to make the point that we shouldn't be fooling around with this issue. We're grown adults here. We need to get together and realize that the debt ceiling is too important to play politics with. And I know that since I've been here, and this government shutdown issue is a prime example, politics have trumped policy nearly every time. It is time to endorse the right policy. Get a long-term, comprehensive deal that isn't a patch, that doesn't add to the uncertainty, but yet puts us by the continuing resolution, gets us out on the debt ceiling so we don't have to deal with this every 45 or 90 days, and we don't have to deal with the debt ceiling just about every year. And I think if we were to do that and that cooler minds would prevail, I think we could see this country start to really grow economically. We would see the unemployment drop even more than we've seen it previously, and we'd see this country go on to an opportunity to pay down our debt and deficit in a way that makes sense for our kids and grandkids. I don't know where this is going to end. I can tell you that the folks back home see it for what it is, and they're tired of the foolishness, and they want to see it stopped. And I can tell you that what makes it particularly frustrating for me is that as I see businesses start to expand, as I see entrepreneurs starting to be ready to take chances, they look at what goes on in Washington, D.C. and go, whoa, this isn't worth it. We don't know what the future is to bring because of the uncertainty of not only the continuing resolution, keeping the government open, but also the talk that has been revolving now for some time around the debt ceiling talk. So with that, Mr. President, I would hope that this body would do the right thing and that it would push the House to do the right thing, and that is put the clean resolution on the floor in the House. Let's get the debt ceiling behind us. Let's talk about debt and deficit reduction in a meaningful way. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, would my friend from Montana stay for just a second so I can ask a clarification on one of your beginning statements?
Sure.
You had at the beginning some good numbers on there, and if I do the math right, I said it when the Senator from Oregon was here, but what I saw, and we hear over and over again, you know, there's not negotiations going on, there's not compromising going on, but if I hear your numbers right, there was negotiations, there was compromise. Matter of fact, there was so much compromise, we went to the House number, not to our number, to their number. We actually reduced the budget on an annualized basis, $70 billion. Isn't that what your numbers, I mean, you're on the Appropriations Committee, I'm on the Appropriations Committee. There's one thing we do know a lot about, and that's numbers.
Yeah, and it is. It's a much lower number. And I will tell you this, the senator from Alaska, the good senator from Alaska, That is what happened in the negotiations. And the upshot of all that is that we would get a clean CR coming back if we negotiated down to that figure, that there wouldn't be a bunch of games being played.
A lot of stuff added on that wasn't necessary.
That's exactly
correct. We can
correct.
debate those later, but...
Absolutely, and should debate them later. But the bottom line is it's important we keep our government open. Why? Because we're wasting a ton of money the way it's being done right now. And this piecemeal funding for trying to get political advantage is crazy. People see it for what it is. It's political gamesmanship.
Well, isn't it odd that they pass let's pay everybody, 435 to 0, they pass it, but they only want to have some of them come back to work. Now, if you're a fiscal conservative, and I think we're from Montana, Alaska, fairly conservative state, I want them working if we're paying them. Doesn't that make sense? But instead it seems like they're just giving a couple agencies, but they're still going to pay everybody. I don't know where the logic is there.
Well, I mean, why not have them come back? We know the value of work.
Absolutely.
We know the value of the work to the self-esteem. We know the fact that those folks are important in my office. If they weren't important in my office, they wouldn't be working for me. And they're important to everybody's offices as we go and tell folks what's going on, help a lot of our constituents when they have problems with some of the agencies around. But the bottom line is they're sitting at home. These aren't rich folks. A lot of them are hand to mouth. They don't know how long this government shutdown is going to go on, and they want to go back to work.
And I guess one more, you said something I thought was very interesting on the budget deficit. You and I are both kind of new around here. You're a couple of years older than me. I came here 2 years after you. But we came in, and when you deal with the debt ceiling, which is really about just paying your bills, you got to pay the bills that were racked up for a period of time before we got here. But they came. I think in 2009, the deficit per year was $1.4 trillion. This year, that just kind of closed out because we're still not done, was about $630 billion, almost a 60% reduction in the deficit. So we're headed the right way, but this isn't helping.
Yeah, and my last point would be this. If we're going to get the debt and deficit under control, one of the things we have to do is grow the economy. By stopping government with this continuing resolution, by talking this silly talk about increasing the debt limit, it does not do good things for our economy. In fact, it takes it in the wrong direction. We see businesses contract when we start seeing what's going on here in Washington. It really is time to start using some common sense. Folks, there's folks that claim to be business representatives out there. I talked to a bunch of businesses this afternoon.
Oh, you run?
Every one of them.
You're a farmer.
I am. And every one of them said they ought to quit messing around, get to an agreement, have the debates on debt and deficit you need to have because they're important debates to have, but don't hold up the debt limit and don't hold up the government's funding in the process. I want to thank the senator from Alaska.
I think my good friend from Montana taking a few minutes to just let me ask a few questions and emphasize a couple points. Mr. President, I'll end here. Just say, that's what this debate is about. It's about the simple question, allowing a vote on the House side. If they believe that they don't have the votes, because obviously the Speaker over there believes he doesn't have the votes and he doesn't support it being voted on, then let it be on the floor, it will fail, and then we'll be back at the drawing board. But the reality is he knows. He knows the votes are there. We would be out of this shutdown. The result would be that people would be back to work, services would be provided, and the businesses will not be losing confidence that they're losing every day today, or like the market. Once again, since this debate started and the threats of shutdown to the actual shutdown, the stock market over the last 15, 16 days has lost almost 600 points. Now, those are people, most people don't pay a lot of attention to that, but if you have an education account, a 401k account, a retirement account, IRA, or you have a little money set aside, it has direct impact to your livelihood over the long haul. So I would just encourage the Speaker on the House of Representatives, Speaker Boehner, to allow a simple vote. We have on every bill that's come over here. Now, they haven't prevailed, but we've allowed a vote. That's the process. But over there, they refuse to. They keep sending back gimmicks. And it is surprising to me to understand this logic. They want to pay every single federal employee, but they're only going to have some of them come back to work. Makes no sense. If you're paying your employees, have them come back and work. You know, I run a small business. My wife runs a small business. I know the senator from Montana who just left here runs a small business. You don't pay your people not to come to work. When you pay them to work, you pay them to work. You were a governor, Mr. President, and you wouldn't say one day, oh, by the way, I'm going to pay everyone stay home for a month. No, you'd have them come to work if you're paying them, unless they have leave or vacation time. But this is crazy. It passes unanimous on the House side. And then they say, but we don't want you to work. The taxpayers should be outraged about that. I'm happy. I want to vote on that bill. I want to vote on that furlough bill here. I want to make sure everyone gets paid, and then I want to follow it up with the CR and put everyone back to work. That's what we should be doing here, not these games where they bring over political statements with the items they're bringing over. You know, do we want to vote against veterans? Of course not. I have the highest per capita veterans in my state compared to any other state. Veterans are important to our economy, they're important to our country, and they serve this country. They deserve every benefit. But to play this game of leveraging, the American people see right through this. These guys who keep bringing these little schemes over here, for them to think that they're thinking one step ahead of the American people, they're absolutely wrong. The American people are 2 or 3 steps ahead of us. They see the show and tell that's going on, and it doesn't make sense. Again, if you're going to fund all the employees, and again, 435 to 0, they voted to fund all the employees to get paid, but then they only want someone to go to work. Makes no sense to me at all. So I appreciate the time. I appreciate the President's time allowing me an opportunity to engage with a couple of my colleagues down here. But I just wanted, every time they spoke, I wanted to explain and show kind of the farce that's going on over there and what's happening over there with a small group of Tea Party, very small, 30, 40 members over here who decided how they're going to run the government here. The government is not run by one group. It is run on compromise and negotiations. And again, we've negotiated all the way down to their number, $70 billion in annualized cuts. We have put every single one of their bills on the floor here. We have voted on it. And now all we ask is one simple vote. A clean CR that sits in the Speaker's office, ready to be put on the floor. And he even says it will fail. Okay, let's see. Let's see where his votes are. Let's see where it all is. And if it fails, then we'll be right back where we are today, so no difference. So what does he fear? He fears the fact it will pass. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And then 5.
Mr. President, has to vacate the quorum.
The quorum call will be suspended. Senator from Alaska.
Something's at the desk.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations. Colin Sterling Bruce of Illinois to be United States District Judge. Sarah Lee Ellis of Illinois to be United States District Judge.
Under the previous order, there will now be 30 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form.
I ask consent that the time be equally charged to both sides during the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
I suggest an absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, the quorum call be suspended.
And Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
Considering nominations, executive nominations, or judicial nominations from the previous order.
The Senate is considering judicial nominations from the previous order.
Thank you. Mr. President, today we are going to vote on 2 of the district court nominations pending before the Senate. I'm glad we're getting to these important nominations. We should have, weeks ago, they should have, normal course of events, should have just been done in a routine fashion, but there has been this concerted effort to slow up President Obama's judges, something we've never seen with other presidents, but we do with him. But I am glad at least these are going through. But I hope that on the same vein, we see a needless government shutdown. I hope it comes to an end so the Senate can tend to the business of the country, including, as I said on the floor the other day, ensuring that the courts have the judges they need. In fact, as far as the judges, speaking of both from Illinois, have the supports of Senator Durbin and Senator Kirk, I'd ask my full statement regarding those judges be placed in the record as though read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I couldn't help but think, and I have spoken before, I think, every day since this happened, and what has become all too familiar scene from the Capitol the past few years, we find ourselves in a stalemate over providing funding to keep the federal government running. Now, I share the frustration of most Americans, Republicans and Democrats, that what was once a regular business of Congress, funding the government, has been replaced by political theater and another artificial, made in Congress crises that might get a number of people on television, but while doing it, they imperil the economy, and in many ways, large and small, every single family in America. Makes no difference what their politics are, they're imperiled. But of course, there's an easy way to resolve this fabricated crisis. The House of Representatives could simply vote in the Senate bill. It's a clean, continuing resolution. It has no partisan ideological riders on the right or the left, and it provides the funding necessary to keep the federal government open through November 15th. And Speaker Boehner could accept the offer that Leader Reid made to get on with the business of negotiating and passing this year's appropriations bills, bills that were supposed to have all been passed by the end of last month. Now, over the past week, the House has had ample opportunity to end this shutdown. They could have passed the Senate's legislation to fund all the federal agencies. They could have provided Congress the time it needs to find a path forward. But a faction, not the whole House by any means, a faction of extreme House members, supported by their leadership, have prevented the full body from voting on the Senate bill. Extreme Republican members certainly don't represent the kind of Republicans we have in Vermont, but these extreme Republican House members have prevented the full body from voting on the Senate bill. Instead, what do? They're all collecting their salaries, but they close the government, all because they want to erode access to affordable private health care options for millions of uninsured Americans. It's unconscionable, and they've not come up with the alternative. They say, we'll get rid of you being able to have your college-age children on your health insurance, but we have no alternative. We're going to get rid of the ability for your spouse who may have had a pre-existing condition, a cancer, diabetes, or heart condition, from having insurance. We're going to get rid of that ability, but we have nothing as an alternative. We're going to get rid of you who might be a low-income person to get insurance, but we have no alternative. We just want to get rid of it. Now, there is no question this is a crisis driven by a handful of partisans on the other side of the aisle for whom there's no path to compromise on just about anything. Well, with one exception. They do find every possible opportunity before a television camera to talk about what they've done. But the American people, I don't know what they're doing. They're hurting them terribly. The demands are both constantly shifting and breathtakingly unreasonable. One of them says, oh, we have to have something for this. Well, what do you have to have? Well, I don't know, but we have to have something. Oh, come on. These are like little children in a sandbox arguing. But while the Senate has voted on one flawed House proposal after another, the House refuses to vote on anything from the Senate. Incredibly, these same extremists, and they are extremists, are now threatening to employ the same harmful tactic when the federal government reaches a statutory borrowing limit in a couple of weeks. Now, it's interesting when the Speaker says, well, we're not going to be able to do anything on debt limit. And you saw the stock market, which was projected to be up 150, 200 points, suddenly go whoosh, like that and down 150 points, 300-point swing right then. So in other words, we'll continue our sloganeering and our stalling, and no matter what that might do to your savings for retirement or pension, or kids in college, or small businesses that are trying to make money so they can stay in business. We don't care what happens to you because we got to be on the evening news and talk about how we're standing up for America. No, they're not standing up for America. In fact, the Treasury Department reported last week that a failure to raise the debt limit could cause credit markets to freeze, the dollar to plummet, interest rates to rise precipitously. The report goes on to say a government default on its debts might prove so catastrophic that it could potentially result in a financial crisis and recession that could echo the events of 2008 or worse. They don't seem to care so long as they get on television. Well, we've all heard a lot of talk and seen a lot of crocodile tears about getting our fiscal house in order. Oh, what a great campaign slogan. But too many who got elected with such bumper sticker sloganeering are not following through on their constitutional responsibility to govern. Again, just look at their list of ransom demands for reopening the government. The first one blows a $100 billion hole in the national debt by repealing the Affordable Care Act. The second one adds $30 billion more to the debt without offering any suggestion for making up the revenue. The third still keeps closed important government functions like providing food assistance to young children, expectant mothers, seniors, continuing health trials that might cure cancer or childhood diseases, and the list goes on and on. Now, it's truly unfortunate that a relative few who are obviously enjoying the limelight, a relatively few in Congress, on the other side of the aisle, Republicans in Congress, are willing to play politics and brinkmanship at a time when the public demands statesmanship. And their reckless actions are hurting families all across America. And I'd remind them they're hurting Democratic families, Republican families, independent families. They're hurting Americans. For this small extreme faction, it seems compromise is a dirty word, and distrust is a political tactic. That may explain why we've heard excuse after excuse for blocking the budget discipline they so desperately pled for just a short time ago. You know, they said, why don't you get a budget? Why didn't the Senate get a budget? Well, Mr. President, I was in the chair at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning when we were voting on that budget. We voted all day and all night, and we finished it. That was back in April. And so what happens when we want to go to a conference on it and work out the differences with the House? Instead of in a conference, if you count the number of people beyond, there'd be more Republicans than Democrats. There was a Republican senator who stood on the floor and said, I object to going to a conference. Same one had given speeches about how come we don't have a budget. And then when we pass a budget, we have to go to the next step to work it out with the House. Oh, no, I object to that. Probably because he was surprised we'd actually done our work. And the chair, Patty Murray, who done such a brilliant job in getting together a budget to save the taxpayers' money, they didn't act terrified that it might actually pass. They've objected 19 times to going for that budget conference. They've shut the government down. They're preparing to cause the government's first ever debt default in our nation's history. That's right. The Speaker of the House is now holding the government's credit hostage. He's threatening this weekend to let the nation default come October 17th when the debt limit is reached, unless even more draconian spending cuts are made. Is there any reason markets all over the world are dropping? Is there any reason why the rest of the world looks at America and says, what are you doing? Why are you letting the children in the sandbox take over? We caught just a preview of the chaos such a move could create. Stock futures, I mentioned, dropped sharply. European stocks dropped dramatically in the wake of House Republicans' newest ultimatum. This is no way to government. It's also not an example to set to the rest of the world. We have to go to the rest of the world and say, help us, work with us to stop the terrorists that threaten the United States. Help us, work with us so that we can export our goods to your country. Help us, work with us to bring about stability around the world. And they say, you won't do a thing to even help yourself. Why should we help you? President, I talked to some of these countries. I talked to the people, and they're shaking their head. They're saying, what has happened to America? So it's far past time for reason and sanity to return to Congress on this government shutdown, on setting our budget priorities, a whole host of other issues. Let's let the grown-ups come back and start running things around here. I remain ready to work with people on both sides of the aisle, and I'm proud of my record, the senior-most member of this body, that year after year after year, legislation I've had with both Republicans and Democrats as co-sponsors have passed. The distinguished presiding officer was governor of one of the great commonwealths of this country, Commonwealth of Virginia. He brought Republicans and Democrats together. It was a model for the rest of the country. It can be done, but it takes grown-ups to do it. You're always going to have a few loud voices who say, oh, we can't possibly do this. American public expect the people who really lead to be leaders. So let's work with people on both sides of the aisle. Let's find a solution that ends this needless shutdown and gets us and hundreds of thousands of federal employees back to doing our work on behalf of the American people. But that starts with the House voting on the Senate bill to reopen the American people's government. That bill is sitting over there right now. Bring it to a vote. Right now, everybody wants to vote maybe. Vote yes or vote no. Vote yes, we'll put Americans back to work, and we'll reopen those trials to find cures for childhood diseases. Or vote no. We want to continue to be children in the sandbox. Well, Mr. President, I'm blessed with grandchildren. I like to think none of my grandchildren would act as childish as a small group of ultra-right-wing Republicans have in the House. They don't reflect the great tradition of the Republican Party in my state or this country. They reflect an atmosphere of people who care only for themselves, no matter what they say. They care only for their own egos and their own political future. It's time they start caring for the United States of America. See nobody else seeking recognition, I would suggest the absence of a quorum. If time is being charged, to be charged to both sides.
Without objection, then the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Vermont.
I ask call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, nobody else seeking recognition. I ask consent to all time be yielded back.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Question occurs on the Bruce nomination.
That's one. Ask the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker.
How are you tonight? Yes.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo.
Oh, Dallas Sands. Yeah, I know Dallas.
Mr. Cruz.
Okay. What time is it? 4:30. Pretty late in the afternoon. Where's the work? 4:30 in the morning. I'm telling you. 4:30.
Mr. Donnelly.
Doing a great job in the chair. I'll try to be there. I don't know what happened. Not off the rails yet. Not yet.
Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hogan. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans.
Three guys in Major League history.
Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk.
I read. Reading is
Mr. Klobuchar.
How are you? Good.
Good weekend? Did you go home?
Got home and shoveled feet of snow.
Ms. Landrieu.
Front end loader to dig the house out where Bobby was with the dog and no electricity. Yeah.
Mr. Leahy.
Well, it was. I had to get home. Yeah, oh, it would. If she were here, it would have been a good weekend for us to stay here together. But,
Mr. Lee.
yeah, we had over 2 feet at our house. But, you know, they were broadcasting live from the weather channel. Electricity was still out of certain places.
Mr. Levin.
We needed, the ranch.
They came out from Nebraska.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey.
His name's a Tonga one day. One of writes the New Yorkers. Medical folks are going to do it.
Mr. McCain.
We sent it out to the schedulers at the
Mrs. McCaskill.
People watching think that's my favorite.
All three.
Your leadership.
Yes.
Too much smaller.
Mr. McConnell.
When Brady Hams
Yes, right.
Mr. Menendez.
I'm pretty sure. His high home run is.
Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch.
Okay, it's basically benchmarking buildings.
Mr. Roberts.
This is Bill. This is something that
Mr. Rockefeller.
and all this is
Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders.
if Mike wants to
Mr. Schatz.
it establishes how much they're using.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott.
We wouldn't end up
Mr. Sessions.
the concept is basically that they've found that when you do that,
Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby.
that's not it at all. Say like platinum.
Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune.
And you save energy.
Mr. Toomey. Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Chiesa, Coates, Cochran, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Donnelly, Fisher, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Markey, McConnell, Mikulski, Moran, Paul, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Roberts, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye.